They don't trend, they don't tweet. But behind Canada's clean image lies a circle of families who quietly shape everything, from what you eat, to what you read, to how policy gets written. Some built frozen food empires, others control oil, media, or your local grocery store. But one family in particular, their influence runs deeper than most Canadians realize. Watch till the end, because that name might already be on your next receipt. Who are Canada's old money families? They don't sit in Parliament, but they shape what Parliament funds. They're rarely photographed, yet their last names are printed on hospitals, university wings, and the side of your grocery bags. In Canada, old money doesn't scream. It builds quietly through holding companies, land, infrastructure, and institutions that touch nearly every aspect of daily life, from beer and banking to frozen food, media, oil, and national retailers. A handful of families have quietly engineered control over the country's economic backbone. Unlike the loud dynasties of Wall Street or Hollywood, Canadian old money prefers privacy over profile. Most of their wealth is held through private family trust, passed down through generations, avoiding the noise of public markets. Their power isn't visible, it's embedded. Some names like Weston, Molson, and Thompson are easy to miss because they're designed that way. But their influence, it's felt every time you step into a Loblaws, read the Globe and Mail, or see a jersey stitched with history. Comment, "I've seen their name but never knew the story," if one of these families already shaped your life without you realizing it. Because once you know where to look, you'll start seeing them everywhere. The Molson family. In 1786, while the United States was still defining its constitution, John Molson was brewing beer on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. That single brewery would become the seed of Canada's oldest corporate dynasty. Today, the Molson name is synonymous with Canadian identity, but the family's empire goes far beyond beer. What began as a modest brewing operation evolved into a vertically integrated empire. By the 1800s, the Molsons were building steamships, financing railroads, and founding banks. They weren't just making products, they were laying the infrastructure of a growing nation. Their signature brand, Molson Canadian, is still one of the country's most recognized beers, now under Molson Coors, a multinational beverage conglomerate. But the Molsons retained something more valuable than distribution rights: cultural capital. They embedded themselves into the nation's DNA through strategic philanthropy and civic leadership. Hospitals, universities, concert halls, many still carry the Molson name. And in the world of sports, the family holds a long-standing connection to the Montreal Canadiens, one of the most iconic teams in NHL history. That connection is more than symbolic, it's ownership. Yet, despite being one of Canada's most public founding dynasties, the Molsons have never relied on spectacle. Their wealth is measured not in headlines, but in institutions, businesses, buildings, and traditions that have lasted centuries. Unlike families that fade after 2 or 3 generations, the Molsons institutionalized their wealth through private ownership and legacy trusts, allowing them to navigate political shifts, market crashes, and generational transitions with remarkable consistency. In a country that often prizes humility over hierarchy, the Molsons mastered a rare balance: visible influence with understated presence. They didn't just sell beer. They helped build a nation that drinks it. The Saputo family. The story begins in 1954 with a Sicilian immigrant and a cheese press in the basement of a modest Montreal home. What started as a small family operation would quietly evolve into one of the largest dairy companies in the world. Lino Saputo, son of founder Giuseppe Saputo, saw beyond mozzarella and ricotta. While competitors focused on regional distribution, he engineered Saputo Inc. into a vertically integrated global force, expanding across Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK through strategic acquisitions and relentless scaling. Today, Saputo Inc. generates over $15 billion in annual revenue, owns brands like Dairyland, Armstrong, Scotsburn, and Woolwich Dairy, and ranks among the top 10 dairy processors globally. But the family never allowed the empire's size to distort its image. Publicly traded, yes, but controlled through private holdings, with the Saputo family maintaining tight governance and cultural consistency across divisions. Lino Saputo himself kept a low public profile for much of his career, rarely seeking headlines. The focus remained on operational efficiency, market penetration, and product quality. No luxury branding, no flash, just scale, consistency, and control. What distinguishes the Saputo family is their immigrant-rooted pragmatism. Every move was calculated to preserve legacy and expand reach, whether entering Latin American cheese markets or acquiring fluid milk producers in Australia. And through it all, they avoided the public spectacle that often shadows rapid corporate growth. The family's wealth, estimated in the multi-billion-dollar range, was never flaunted. Instead, they invested in philanthropy, endowing hospitals, universities, and community initiatives. Often under the radar, the Saputo Foundation quietly supports food security, healthcare, and youth programs, reinforcing their image as builders, not celebrities. From a basement workshop to a global supply chain, the Saputo story isn't just one of scale, it's one of disciplined expansion, cultural coherence, and generational planning. In a country that often underplays its giants, the Saputos became one by staying small where it mattered and going big where it counted. The McCain family. In 1957, two brothers from rural New Brunswick turned a factory-sized gamble into a global food revolution. Harrison and Wallace McCain didn't just make frozen French fries, they engineered a supply chain that would dominate supermarket freezers around the world. What started in a small Canadian town became McCain Foods, now the largest producer of frozen potato products on Earth, generating over $10 billion annually. Their fries are served in restaurants, school cafeterias, and fast food giants across more than 160 countries. You've likely eaten them without even knowing. But the genius wasn't just in the product. It was in the process. The McCain family invested heavily in cold chain logistics, automated processing plants, and real-time data systems, decades before those became industry norms. While competitors focused on branding, the McCains built infrastructure. Their dominance was rooted in efficiency, not visibility. They also understood vertical integration. From farming partnerships to distribution fleets, McCain Foods minimized dependencies by owning the entire life cycle of the product. It wasn't just about fries, it was about control. Though the business became public, the family influence remained embedded. Internal disputes, including a high-profile split between the founding brothers, never derailed operations. The next generation maintained board-level leadership, reinforcing the McCain presence in both direction and legacy. Beyond potatoes, the family quietly expanded into appetizers, frozen pizzas, and ready-made meals, acquiring brands across Europe and Australia. Their approach? Enter quietly, scale fast, standardize operations globally. Philanthropy also plays a role. The McCain Foundation has funded education, healthcare, and environmental projects, especially in Atlantic Canada, though often without fanfare. Comment: didn't know they were behind that, if you've seen McCain products in your freezer without realizing the empire behind them. Because while others chased food trends, the McCains built the system that delivers them: hot, fast, and global. The Richardson family. If old money in Canada had a blueprint, the Richardson family quietly perfected it. Their roots trace back to James Richardson, who began trading grain in Kingston, Ontario in 1857. What started as a regional grain brokerage evolved into one of the country's most durable private empires, stretching across agriculture, energy, real estate, and financial services. But unlike other dynasties that leaned into visibility, the Richardsons built a legacy on discretion. Today, James Richardson and Sons Limited is still family-owned and controlled, now in its sixth generation. Few Canadian companies can match that kind of continuity, especially with such diverse holdings. Through subsidiaries like Richardson International, they dominate grain handling and food processing. Their reach extends across the Canadian prairies, with one of the country's largest networks of grain elevators, oilseed processing plants, and export terminals. But agriculture was only the foundation. The family diversified into energy infrastructure with investments in oil exploration and pipeline systems. Then came real estate portfolios, quietly acquired and managed through private holding companies. And finally, financial services, where Richardson Wealth became one of Canada's most respected independent wealth management firms, catering to high net worth clients with the same long-term discipline the family applied to its own fortune. Despite controlling assets worth multiple billions, the family has kept operations private, avoiding the quarterly pressures of public markets. Their businesses are structured to resist short-term volatility and political headwinds. Decision-making remains centralized, deliberate, and often generational in scope. The Richardsons rarely give interviews. Their names don't appear on luxury marquees, but across rail yards, commodity markets, and boardrooms, their influence is quietly entrenched. Not because they chased headlines, but because they built structures designed to outlast them. In a world obsessed with scale and speed, the Richardsons chose something else: duration. A fortress of capital, guarded by privacy and reinforced by time. The Weston family. At the intersection of food, pharmacy, and fashion sits one of Canada's most quietly powerful dynasties, the Weston family. Their empire began with bread. George Weston's bakery, founded in 1882. But flour was only the beginning. Over generations, the Westons expanded, diversified, and evolved into a holding structure that would touch nearly every Canadian household. Today, they control Loblaw Companies Limited, Shoppers Drug Mart, No Frills, Real Canadian Superstore, and a constellation of private labels that move millions of units each day. What separates the Westons isn't just ownership, it's brand invisibility by design. While most retail families build empires under one name, the Westons embedded themselves through layers: corporate entities, brand portfolios, and quietly controlled subsidiaries. Their private label strategy, including President's Choice, allowed them to dominate shelf space and consumer habits without being tied to a single retail identity. The family's wealth, estimated in the multi-billion-dollar range, is held through entities like George Weston Limited, functioning more like a private equity engine than a legacy retailer. Board seats and executive roles have remained in the family for decades, ensuring long-term alignment between capital, control, and company culture. But they didn't ignore the future. As consumer behavior shifted, the Westons moved early into e-commerce, digital loyalty programs, and health-based retail positioning. The acquisition of Shoppers Drug Mart for $12.4 billion in 2013 wasn't just expansion, it was market insulation. It placed them at the center of both essential goods and daily routines, from prescription drugs to produce. Beyond retail, the family holds luxury assets abroad, including Selfridges in the UK and previously Holt Renfrew in Canada, bridging high spend and high arsenic under a single capital structure. Their influence isn't loud, it's logistical, built into supply chains, payment systems, and product placement. In the background, but always in control. A dynasty that doesn't just follow demand, it architects it. The Thompson family. No family controls more of Canada's media and information infrastructure than the Thompsons, and few do it with less visibility. Their empire began in the newspaper business. Roy Thompson, a schoolteacher turned salesman, bought his first radio station in the 1930s and expanded into print, creating a vast portfolio of local newspapers across Ontario. But what began as regional journalism soon evolved into something far more expansive and durable. By the 1970s, the family had acquired the Times of London, then pivoted again away from traditional newsprint and into financial data and information services. That foresight became the foundation for what is now Thomson Reuters, a global leader in legal, tax, and financial analytics used by governments, law firms, and multinationals around the world. Today, the family holds a controlling interest in Thomson Reuters through Woodbridge Company Limited, a private holding firm based in Toronto. Their estimated fortune exceeds $50 billion, making them not only the wealthiest family in Canada, but also one of the most influential in the global information economy. They also maintain ownership of the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper of record, as well as a significant stake in Bell Canada, one of the country's largest telecommunications companies. This positions them at the intersection of journalism, digital infrastructure, and real-time data, quietly shaping the narratives and networks Canadians rely on. What separates the Thompsons from other dynasties is not just their reach, but their restraint. Rarely photographed, seldom interviewed, the family avoids overt branding and public influence campaigns. Their power flows through platforms, not personalities. In a media landscape obsessed with immediacy, the Thompsons bet on infrastructure, subscription models, and long-horizon assets. Where others chase virality, they built the pipelines that supply verified information to the world's decision-makers. Control without noise, ownership without exposure. In the age of content saturation, the Thompsons remain the editors of what matters. The Irving family. In New Brunswick, there's one name that dominates more than headlines. It runs the entire supply chain. The Irving family didn't just build an empire, they built the ecosystem around it. Founded by K.C. Irving in the early 20th century, the dynasty began in gas and gradually expanded into everything that touched it: forestry, shipping, construction, retail, and media. But their real power wasn't in owning multiple businesses, it was in owning every stage of every process. Vertical integration became their blueprint. Today, the Irving Group operates more than 300 companies under a labyrinth of private ownership structures, from logging forests to processing pulp, from operating gas stations to refining oil, from building ships to reporting the news. The Irvings control inputs, distribution, and even public perception. Their refinery in St. John, operated by Irving Oil, is the largest in Canada and valued at several $1 billion. It supplies over 300 gas stations across eastern Canada and New England. Their timber operations are among the biggest in North America. Their fleet of ocean tankers and trucks ensures product never leaves Irving control. But it doesn't stop at infrastructure. The family also owns several regional newspapers, radio stations, and television networks, consolidating economic power with information control, a structure that has sparked public debate but never broken their hold on the region. Critics argue it's too much influence concentrated in too few hands. Supporters call it efficient, locally grounded capitalism. Either way, the Irvings have embedded themselves so deeply into Atlantic Canada's economy that to do business in the region is, in many cases, to do business with them. Comment: is that power or dependence if this level of control makes you think twice about where your products and news are coming from? Because while most families pick an industry, the Irvings picked a province and never let go. The Bronfman family. Few Canadian dynasties rose faster or fell harder than the Bronfman family. Their empire began with liquor. In the early 20th century, Samuel Bronfman built Seagram into one of the largest alcohol producers in the world. The company thrived during Prohibition, capitalizing on cross-border distribution and an expanding global market. By the mid-20th century, Seagram controlled premium spirits like Chivas Regal, Crown Royal, and Martell Cognac, valued in the billions. But power shifted with the next generation. Edgar Bronfman Sr. kept the family fortune growing through measured diversification. He acquired controlling interest in MGM and built Seagram into a cross-sector powerhouse, combining liquor with media, finance, and entertainment holdings. The real pivot came under Edgar Bronfman Jr., who made a high-stakes bet on entertainment. In the 1,990 Seagram's liquor assets, once the core of the empire, for a controlling stake in Universal Studios and Polygram, aiming to transform the family's legacy from liquor to Hollywood. This didn't last. The move exposed the family to volatile markets and misaligned partnerships. Within years, most of the assets were sold off. Billions were lost. The Bronfmans, once synonymous with industrial stability, became a case study in how generational shifts in vision, without guardrails, can unravel a dynasty. Today, the name remains respected in philanthropy and investment, but the empire that once defined Canadian capitalism no longer exists, not because it faded, but because it bet everything on reinvention and lost. The Desmarais family. The Desmarais family didn't build their empire on visibility, they built it on leverage. At the center is Power Corporation of Canada, a financial holding company with assets spanning insurance, wealth management, and global investment vehicles. Originally founded in the 1920s, it became the Desmarais crown jewel when Paul Desmarais Sr. took control in the 1960s, transforming it into one of the most influential business platforms in the country. Through subsidiaries like Great West Lifeco, IG Wealth Management, and Putnam Investments, Power Corp touches trillions in managed assets. Their reach includes financial institutions in Europe, Asia, and North America, yet their name rarely appears on retail signage. But what truly distinguishes the Desmarais legacy is its proximity to power. Over the decades, the family has maintained close relationships with Canadian prime ministers, senior politicians, and global heads of state. Their Montreal estate has hosted heads of government. Their sons and daughters have married into political dynasties. This isn't lobbying, it's alignment. Their influence flows not through media empires or retail chains, but through financial architecture and political networks. Power court boardrooms often overlap with public institutions, think tanks, and international forums, giving the family rare access to both policy formation and capital allocation. While other dynasties dominate consumer markets, the Desmarais strategy has been deep control of capital and soft control of governance. Quiet, deliberate, generational. It's a model where financial power becomes political currency, and institutions, not individuals, carry the name forward. Philanthropy, legacy, and the quiet power of old money. They don't just donate, they design ecosystems. For Canada's wealthiest families, philanthropy isn't charity, it's legacy infrastructure. Through foundations and endowments, they fund hospitals, universities, research labs, and the arts. Not for recognition, but to embed their names into national institutions. The Thompson, Weston, and Desmarais families, among others, quietly channel hundreds of millions into civic life, shaping policy discourse, academic research, and cultural identity without needing to sit in office. Philanthropy becomes soft power, gently influencing what gets built, what gets studied, and what values endure. Comment legacy or leverage if you think these acts of generosity are as strategic as they are generous. Because when old money gives, it often gives with purpose, and what looks like goodwill today becomes architecture tomorrow. Old money doesn't chase the spotlight, it builds the system that powers it. These families aren't just rich, they're embedded. Across generations, they've mastered the quiet game: private ownership, political access, and public invisibility. While others compete for attention, they compete for industries and win. Which family surprised you most? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more untold stories of wealth, power, and legacy across borders, subscribe now. Because next we're revealing the secret billionaires who built global empires from places you've never heard of.